Hey everyone, today we'll be doing a discussion on Cube Draft. This is a sequel to a previous video I made, which you can find linked in the top right corner of the screen right now. Do watch that one first, because this will cover some points that I neglected to touch on in the previous video. Firstly, I will discuss how to organize Cube Draft for a group of players with total number fewer than 8. This is quite a tricky matter. And I've actually received a viewer question on this before, and I'll give the answer here. I will also talk about team variant, which I came up with, and this is an interesting way to spice up your cube and to perhaps encourage more friendliness within your community. After that, I will do a report on the second cube draft that I recently organized. So let's begin. But first, let's jog our memory with the cube draft. The cube, I should say, that we are talking about. This is derived from the Birmingham cube. And yeah, I made quite a few changes to them. Most notably, now it's post-rotation legal, and it has changed quite a bit. But one thing that stays the same is that it is meant for 8 players and has 320 cards in it. Now, this particular cube that I'm using has 324. Why this is the case, I will get to very shortly. In this standard 8-player cube, what happens is that 4 rounds of drafting takes place for each side, and in each round of drafting, players receive a draft pack consisting of 10 cards. As such, on each round, 8 players receive 10 cards each, so 80 cards are used in total per round. With 4 rounds, that adds up to 320. Now, what happens when you do a 4-player draft, for example? Well, one could easily take out a fraction of the cube. In this case, you take out half of the cards and then try to draft as per normal. I did this once, and I personally would strongly recommend against it, because chances are, due to your random selection, even if you randomize it perfectly, there's gonna be certain vital groups of cards that will be more scarce due to the random nature of your splitting the cube into 2. This actually adversely affects enjoyment of the entire draft. In my example, we remove more than the correct proportion of decoders by chance. As such, when it came to the runner draft, we realized that one of the players was going to get a huge advantage because they found the only Guardian Blade, while everyone else was using subpar breakers, like the Force of Nature, which was included in the starter cards, for example. And that's just not fun when someone auto wins just because they were lucky enough to find the only decoder in the entire cube. That's no go. So another way you can do this is to surgically cut up half of the cube. So for example, if there are 15 decoders in the cube, you remove 7 or 8 of them, and you do this systematically for all types of cards. The problem with this is that it's super painstaking. Given that assembling, like sleeving and taking out the cards for the cube itself, is a monumental effort in itself, I would highly not recommend this. Yeah. You have better things to spend your time on. Instead, what I would do is to preserve the 320 card cube in its original state and do this. You change the method of drafting. Instead of each player drafting a card and passing it on each pass, what you do is you instruct players to draft a card and exile 1 card on each pass. This way, half of the cards will end up getting exiled because you are drafting 1 and exiling 1 per pass, which allows you to maintain the same number of cards drafted for each player, while still most likely maintaining balance in terms of card proportions. For example, if someone really gets their hands on their only decoder, the other players only have themselves to blame because they exiled too many decoders and didn't draft any themselves. So to accommodate this, you will have to deal twice as many cards to each player. So each player receives 20 cards on each pass at the start of each pass, as opposed to 10. This works for a 4-player draft. What about a 6-player draft? 6 players is very tricky because the first thing you notice is 320 doesn't divide. It's not divisible by 6. So because of this, we have to use a 324 card cube, which is why the list that you saw earlier had 324 cards. I was building for 6-player cube. This number is divisible by 6. However, because it's no longer a round divisible by 10 number, you end up with some really weird numbers. So how you do this is, in the first half of the draft, in rounds 1 and 2, players receive 13 cards and no exiling takes place. Drafting takes place as per normal. You draft 1 card, you pass your deck to the next player, and so on and so forth. In the latter half, rounds 3 and 4, each player receives 14 cards, and exiling takes place. So you draft 1, exile 1. This way, you will draft 7 cards in each of the latter 2 rounds. Combined with the 13 cards from each of the first 2 rounds, you will still be building a 40-card deck, just as with the 4 and 8-player drafts, while exiling the correct number of cards proportionately for a 6-player draft. The extra 4 cards that you need to include in your cube are rather negligible. You can freely choose between, whatever's not in the cube. It shouldn't affect the cube too much. I just went with, for example, the Corp side, I just went with 1 agenda, a couple of eyes, and a money card or something like that. Just keeping the cube, it won't change the cube very much. So this is a very good way to modify the 320 card cube for varying number of players without having to worry about radically adjusting the cube list itself. And this is quite important because the cube list was originally optimized for a very good drafting and playing experience. Now I'll talk about the team variant that I came up with. This, I was brewing this idea for quite a bit, and I felt that this would have been a very interesting experiment to try out. So normally, drafting takes place individually. You look at your cards, you draft your cards, and you pass your cards on to the next player. In this variant, players play in teams of 2. In your pairs, players will analyze the cards they receive together, draft decks together, and then face off against the other pairs. This encourages players to share ideas with each other, which is really good, especially if your meta happens to be a mix of seasoned players and newbies alike. This way, when you pair a seasoned player with a newbie, it's a very good opportunity for newbies to learn, and a good opportunity for seasoned players to pass on their skills, which is really cool, I think. There's also the strategic aspect for the seasoned player of optimizing 2 decks at once, because you cannot just make one really good deck and one lousy deck, because as we'll explain later, final scoring will be the sum of both players, so both decks need to be good. It was also great because in regular individual drafting, you are not really able to share the amazing things that you see or the funny things you see while busy cube drafting, because you don't want to reveal hidden information to your would-be opponents. You don't want to tell people, oh, I managed to find all 3 copies of Snare. You don't want them to know that. But in pair draft, you can giggle and laugh away, showing your partner the cards that you have drafted, because, well, you won't be playing against them. And we'll explain the technical details of it right now. So, in this team variant, pairs are seated together. They are not seated opposite each other. They'll be seated together and they'll be drafting together. On each pass, each pair will receive 1 draft pack. So you don't get 2 draft packs, 1 for each player. You just get a single draft pack, and both of you make the decisions together. These draft packs will be twice as large. So for example, in an 8-player draft, a draft pack would contain 20 cards instead of 10. That's a lot more cards to look through, so expect the draft to take longer. On each path, especially because with the added discussion time between pairs, draft time can take very long. On each pass, the players will draft and exile twice as many cards as before. So in your standard 8-player draft, you will draft 2 cards per pass instead of 1. These 2 cards can go both to your own deck, your partner's deck, or split 1-1 each. It doesn't really matter. You don't even have to decide whether they go to yourself or your partner. You can just allocate them in one common pool, because at the end of the day, you can freely trade cards after the drafting phase is over. You can even trade cards with your partner in between rounds. So this encourages players to pick generically good cards, but also to consider again, consider both decks while being built at the same time. Even though you are allowed to mix and match cards between yourself and your opponent, chances are you probably still want to keep a pile separate for yourself and a pile separate for your opponent, because you might be building two very different decks that require two different sets of ice, different sets of economy, and so on. More technical details: during the playoff phase, partners shall never be paired off as opponents. Everyone else is fair game. In 2 versus 2, that is in the 4-player format, you can only play 2 rounds, because you cannot play the 3rd round, because your 3rd round will be against your opponent, and I mean your partner themselves. So that is a limitation of this format. If you only have 4 players, you can only run 2 rounds. With 6 or 8 players, this you have more leeway. However, pairing should be preset rather than using Tomb or any Swiss pairing system. The problem with a Swiss pairing system is that it does not take into account partnership, and so has a very good chance of allocating pairings that will end you up in a dead end where partners are forced to play against each other, or players are forced to play against each other multiple times. What I would suggest is to number players off depending on how they are seated, and do a preset pairing. On your screen you can see a sample preset pairing for 6 players, which was what I did in my cube draft. So this ensures that no 2 players play each other more than once, and no partners play each other. In the final scoring total, instead of each the highest the player with the most wins winning the entire tournament, winning is calculated as a pair. So the total score within your pair is the determining factor. As such, again, it encourages players to optimize both decks rather than just to power all the good cards in one deck and leave the other deck to rot. Now, in this second cube draft that I organized, I had 6 players. Again, explains the 324 card cube. And again, the drafting phase took very long. It actually took more than 90 minutes, which was pretty crazy. I did not anticipate it to take that long, but the combination of the many cards, the big draft packs, combined with the fact that players needed to discuss with each other which cards to draft, which cards to burn, meant that the drafting phase ended up being quite extended. And this is not a problem if you have an entire afternoon to burn. However, if you're doing it as an evening thing or the non-weekend, I would recommend staying away from this. So this is something to take note of if you're organizing a cube draft. Logistics wise, I found that having demarcated areas for exiling cards, if you're doing a 6 or 4 player variant, is extremely helpful. It can be very easy to mix cards up. You have a pile for your own drafted cards, a pile for exiled cards, and a pile where you passing zone where you pass cards to your opponents. So because of this, I decided to bring inverted box lids to store exiled cards, and that really helped. It made things a lot clearer, and this is something I would recommend if you're organizing a cube draft, as it results in fewer mix-ups. One thing I realized as a player from doing the team variant is that there is lots of insight you can gain from discussing picks and drafts with your partner. I was paired with Andre, a fellow top 16 Worlds 2016 competitor, and we ended up getting a Corp draft pack that consisted of 2 medical breakthroughs, which made us really happy because we were playing a never advanced strategy. So I initially wanted to take both medical breakthroughs, but then Andre provided some really glistening insight. He said, why not draft just one of the medical breakthroughs and another good card from the pack? The medical breakthrough will almost certainly make its way back to us on the next pass, because no one is going to draft a lone medical breakthrough as a blank 4-2. So that was a really brilliant idea. I would never have came up with that on my own. So these are the kinds of insights that you can gain from talking out a draft with a partner. And that's something I really love about this team format. Speaking of Andre, this was the Corp deck that we drafted together for him, and it was broken as heck. We placed a lot of emphasis on drafting the good agendas, and boy did we get the awesome agendas. Unfortunately, the medical breakthrough drafting play ended up biting us in our butt because someone decided to deny us the last medical breakthrough. So we did not get the final MBT, but the rest of the agendas were phenomenal. We had the perfect rush agenda in Oaktown, which increases your tempo as you score it, and we had the Bill resequencing combo. So our deck essentially had 8 agendas that were worth 2 points to us, but only 6 of them were worth 2 points to the opponent. So that's absolutely amazing. For those of you who haven't caught on to it yet, resequencing allows you to place an agenda counter on Bill to make it worth 3 points. Essentially, this makes scoring a genetic resequencing worth 2. It makes genetic resequencing a 3-2 when you score it, but only a 3-1 when your opponent steals it. That's pretty cool. I was very proud of this draft that we did together, and Andre did pretty well with this deck. Here's another amazing Corp deck. This was done by Ed. He went with a similar idea of small agendas, and instead of doing a never advanced strategy that we did, he went pure fast advance. Look at the fast advance cards: Audacity, Biotic Labor, and Political Dealings. That's fast advance too. He also has 2 archive memories to recur them, and a boatload of draw. All the clearances that were in the cube to draw these cards, and localized product lines to find them. This was a menacing fast advance deck because there was no way to stop the fast advance. There's no source, there's no clot in the runner's cube. So basically abusing the fact that fast advance is pretty powerful in this meta, and doing very well with this Corp deck. Pretty amazing stuff. On the runner side, this was an amazing runner deck that I had to play against. This was built by YQ, and this was super disruptive. Even though everyone's identity is neutral, this felt like I was playing against Anarch on steroids. The Imp came down, the Hemorrhage came down, and man, that was nasty. I was playing Grail Eyes, and all my Grail Eyes were getting sniped from my hand. The Hemorrhage was destroying my combos, and yeah, as my opponent kept running my HQ and archives, they were getting security testing runs. They could even get Find the Truth triggers, and they got Doppelganger triggers as well. This was a very well constructed run-based disruptive deck that was pretty powerful, and had the Scavenge on Dogs breakers to back up it. Very powerful, and yeah, very anarchy. This is the sort of stuff that you can only see in draft, because in regular play you cannot mix this many criminal cards and criminal run-based cards and anarch disruptive cards. Finally, here's another one of Ed's nasty creations. This is basically Exile in draft. Even though everyone's ID is blank, this guy here packed a Reaver, which draws you cards as you trash your cards, which is pretty amazing. And ultimately sets you up for the final combo where you use your bin breakers, the MK Ultra and the Black Orchestra, sell them at the start of your turn to Aesops, and then reinstall them for free as you run with Sahasrara, getting more credits actually if you have tag writers on the table. So yeah, all these cool decks coming out as a result of Cube Draft. This is why I love Cube Draft so much, and this is why you really should give it a go. If there are few players in your meta, worry not. I've already given you some tips on how to organize Cube Draft for a 4 or 6 player meta. I highly recommend it because it's something refreshing and something that can possibly get your community hyped up, especially with the team variant format. If you have the time for it, I would recommend that as well. This is no fewer fun than constructed, and yeah, it's a good way to pass the time before the next cycle starts coming out. So give it a shot. Again, I will link to the exact cubes that I used for this particular draft in the description below. Feel free to tweak it. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and thanks for your support. Happy net running. Goodbye.